One of the great debates when it comes to who we are, or when it comes to who we end up being in this life, one of the great debates always comes down to this. So what is it that most shapes us in this life? Or what is it that most shapes our character, we might say? For example, some would say that it is our environment right off the bat that most shapes us. Some would settle there and say that really is a major part of who we become. You see a picture on the screen. I don't know if you can pick me out in that, in the back row, but that is family to some degree. So many of you as moms, you don't get a chance to be in the picture, do you? Because you're taking the picture. I know that is the case usually. But a lot of people would look at this group and say, okay, that's what most kind of forms us, that family we grow up with, that environment, and where we are in the birth order, what parenting is like for us. Now, others would say, no, it's not so much environment that shapes us. It's more so the life experiences that come our way. Can you dig the coats from the mid-'70s? This is probably a sixth grade group that I look back to. Some would say, gosh, more than environment, it's these life experiences, the friends we have, the schools we go to, certainly not just elementary, but middle school, high school, college, and beyond. Or when it comes to life experiences, they would say, gosh, who we end up marrying, the life we build with them, that experience that we have. Some would say when it comes to life experiences, the person we marry, the life we form with them, and then in that life experience category, certainly our kids, the kids that come into our lives, what a difference they make, how they often shape us. I don't think that Skittles, you might be able to pick out who that is in the picture, maybe has shaped me and my character too much in terms of life experiences. But at times, our pets can be right in there. Thinking of the ways our kids shape us, not just when they're children, even when they're high school, college, but then as adults. Now, others would say, and that's the end of our picture montage for today, I think, there we go. Others would say that it's not necessarily our environment, it's not necessarily life experiences, but what it comes down to in so many ways is just DNA, right? How God has formed us in terms of how we are made genetically, they would say. That's what most forms us in this life. Now, what do we know as we gather in this way today beyond a doubt? It's actually all of these things that end up shaping us into truly who we are, right? And yet, having said that, here's what's interesting really about each of these today. Moving forward in your life, and can we agree, honestly, that's the only way we can move, right? We've got to face forward and move forward. But moving forward in our lives, here's what's real. You cannot change, you cannot impact, you cannot adjust how any of these three things have shaped you up to this point in your life, right? Because those things are set, meaning we can complain about the family we grew up in, and sometimes we do that. Or we can regret the types of friends we chose when we were younger, and sometimes we do that. Or we can even wish that God had made us DNA-wise a little bit different, and sometimes we do that. But in the midst of all of that, the fact remains, those things in our past, they're set. And so where does that leave us? And this is good news, so claim this today. That leaves us here with the power to choose what is going to shape us in the days and years ahead. And so with an eye toward that today and in this series, choosing well, with an eye toward that in this series, here's what we want to do. We want to take a look very specifically at the 4 things that God most wants to be shaping us. To do that, we're going to refer to these things each week as virtues, things that perhaps in our culture today, some might say they're not that important anymore, and yet we know as followers of Jesus, these virtues remain very, very important. And so as we talk about these things in this way today as virtues, I want us to first make sure that we're defining that in the same way. For example, virtues are different from ethics, and I want us to be clear about that today. In that ethics primarily speak to a set of moral principles for a group, right? Motivation, therefore, often coming in the form of punishment. Guys, that's not the case with virtues. And that when someone is interested in embracing a certain virtue, they're not motivated by the possibility of getting in trouble. Instead, they're motivated primarily by this internal drive, one that's focused very clearly on this: personal character formation. Say that with me. Personal character formation. One that's focused very clearly on this for us as Christians, the personal character of Christ, right? So knowing that if our character is going to completely conform to that of Christ, knowing that if that's going to happen, then we're going to need to pursue certain very specific virtues. Knowing that, we're going to take a look in this series again at 4 core virtues. The first being this: the virtue of honesty. First today, we want to take a look at the virtue of honesty. To get into this today, we're going to turn our attention to Acts chapter 5. If you want to follow along, we're going to start with verse 1. And we have this up on the screen as well this week. Acts 5, verses 1 through 11. Hear now these words from God's word. Now a man named Ananias, together with his wife Sapphira, also sold a piece of property. That refers to what we're going to talk about in a minute, refers to property that others in the early community would sell to offer proceeds to this early church. They also sold a piece of property. With his wife's full knowledge, Ananias kept back part of the money for himself, but brought the rest and put it at the apostles' feet. Then Peter said, Ananias, how is it that Satan has so filled your heart that you have lied to the Holy Spirit and have kept for yourself some of the money you received for the land? Didn't it belong to you before it was sold? And after it was sold, wasn't the money at your disposal? What made you think of doing such a thing? You have not lied just to human beings, core verse that we'll look at later. You have not lied just to human beings, but to God. When Ananias heard this, he fell down and died, and great fear seized all who heard what had happened. Then some young men came forward, wrapped up his body, and carried him out and buried him. About 3 hours later, his wife came in, not knowing what had happened. Peter asked her, tell me, is this the price you and Ananias got for the land? Yes, she said. That is the price. Peter said to her, how could you conspire to test the Spirit of the Lord? Listen, the feet of the men who buried your husband are at the door, and they will carry you out also. At that moment she fell down at his feet and died. Then the young men came in, and finding her dead, carried her out and buried her beside her husband. Great fear seized the whole church and all who heard. these events. May God bless these words to us this day. Now, two quick thoughts. One, please hang in there today. This might sound like a very negative passage, but I promise you there's great positive meaning in this. So number one, hang in there. But number two, then, let's all admit this as we think about what we have just read together. Our initial reaction probably is the same as that of this church back then, as it's worded here. They were seized with fear. If we had been there, oh my goodness, that would have initially hit us as well. And yet here's what we need to realize. There is such a deeper meaning here that we can find if we'll just dig a little deeper. And so think about this for a moment today. If you take a look back at the first 4 chapters of the book of Acts, you find that one of the defining characteristics of that early community is this. All of the needs that existed among the people, they were taken care of. They were provided for. And how did that take place? People shared what they had. For example, at the end of chapter 4, you find a man named Barnabas, and this is something, again, that happened quite often. You find a man by the name of Barnabas, and he sells a piece of property so that he might give the proceeds to the apostles, to the disciples, giving these proceeds to them with this understanding that they might use what is given in any way they see fit to meet any needs that exist in their hearts and in their minds. Now, that initially points us to something very significant in Acts. Not just the spirit of generosity that we find in that early community, but also this culture of openness, this culture of honesty and trust that's being built up in this early community. Imagine someone giving in this way, saying, again, like Barnabas did, use this as you see fit. Honesty, trust being built into every fiber of that early community. Now, having seen things like that, again, from people like him, here we now have this couple seemingly wanting to do the same thing, Ananias and Sapphira. The problem is, while their thought is indeed a very good one, of course, how they carry this out, and I want you to think of it this way, how they carry this out goes against the very culture that we just spoke of. Because here's what they did in their situation. They sell their property, they give to the disciples, the apostles, what they say are the proceeds of that sale. And yet, truth be told, they also do this. They hold back a portion of those proceeds for themselves. Now, here's what I want us to understand. The problem here is not so much that they didn't give all the money that they received here. It would have been very appropriate for them to say to the apostles, we're going to sell this land, we're going to give you a part of it because we feel like this is what God is calling us to do. Nothing wrong with giving a portion of what God gives. The problem here instead is this. In what they do, they very intentionally choose to turn their back on this virtue of honesty. Or maybe let's say it this way. Because of what they do, they intentionally choose to erode a bit of this honesty, this trust that's being built into the culture of that early church. Guys, knowing that that is not an option for us, turning our back on this virtue, if that is, we want to embrace as our character, the character of Christ, knowing that here are a couple of things that we can learn about this virtue in this passage. The first being this. First off, understand that true honesty always begins in our relationship with God. That's the foundation upon which this virtue is built. Or let me say it this way. True honesty will always spring out of, we might say, our relationship with God. Meaning, initially, if we struggle with that in any way, shape, or form, first place we want to turn is this. So what's going on in my relationship with God? Let's do that initially when it comes to the relationship that Ananias and Sapphira have with God. The state of their relationship with God, only conclusion we can draw is such that they truly believe this about God at that time. That one, either God is not going to notice their dishonesty, or two, if God does notice it, He's not going to really care that much. That's not going to really matter to Him. It's into the midst of that kind of thinking on their part that Peter intervenes in order to, in essence, say this, that God and any choice we make, claim this today, that our relationship with God and any choice we make, those two things have always got to be completely woven together. Meaning you can't fully embrace these virtues that God would have us embrace, especially one like honesty, unless what? Unless we first have fully embraced an honest relationship with God. Makes sense? Here's how Peter attempts to communicate that with these words in essence. Ananias, you thought you were only lying to us, to people, to human beings, to apostles, or the people of this community, but you were really primarily lying to whom? You were really primarily lying to God. John Wooden once said, the true test of a person's character is what he or she does when no one is watching. And as wonderful as that thought is, one that we certainly should embrace each day, what do we also, though, know as human beings? We know that someone is always watching us, right? Not with a judgmental eye. We do not have a God who's always watching us to catch us doing something wrong, right? Instead, this wonderful God is always watching us or watching over us in order to catch us doing all the right things, namely embracing these virtues He calls us to, things like honesty. And so with that in mind today, ask yourself first, are there times you feel like you do cut corners when it comes to honesty? And if so, what does that say to you about your relationship with God? And therefore, what does that say to you about what you need to work on when it comes to your relationship with God? Again, far too often when we ponder maybe where we're bringing dishonesty into our life, far too often we focus on that and we think, how can I fix that? Instead of first saying, gosh, this flows out of my relationship with God, so something must not be right there. First off today, ask yourself, where might you be cutting some corners when it comes to this virtue? And what does that say to you about what you need to work on when it comes to your walk with God? But then here's a second thing we learn about honesty in this passage, that while true honesty does indeed flow out of our relationship with God, it then always flows into our relationships with others. Meaning, whether or not we fully embrace true honesty, whether or not we do that, that's always going to have an impact, not just on us or not just on God, that's always going to also have an impact on those around us in this life. One final look back to Ananias and Sapphira leads us to this thought. Some people might say that what they're caught up in here really isn't that big of a deal. You know, it really doesn't hurt people that much. In fact, some people would say that giving any amount, right? They've given something. Some people would say that giving any amount is better than giving nothing, regardless of the circumstances. And yet here's the deal. When we start thinking like that, it's because, again, we're missing the deeper meaning here. In that it isn't the lesser amount that hurts this community. Instead, what hurts the community is the way in which the dishonesty now cuts into the culture of trust that the early church is trying to build. That's why the response is so strong. Guys, so it is with us at times. In that when we choose to turn our back on the virtue of honesty, and at times we will, even in the little things, it's not so much that that's going to hurt people greatly in that moment, though sometimes that's the case. Instead, more so, the damage is done through this erosion of culture that takes place because of our actions, if you will. This culture of trust that even today we as Christians are trying to daily build up in this community. You know, while the wooden quote from earlier certainly is a meaningful and important one, I think a variation of that quote also helps us here. And that is this: the true influence of a person's character is what he or she does when everyone is watching. And what we need to realize today is this: each day people are watching us much more than we realize, looking to our example that might feed their character in some very positive ways. Guys, as we kick off this new series, here's what I want us to remember. That when it comes to growing into the character of Christ, or when it comes to embracing these key virtues as He did, thinking especially today about the virtue of honesty, when it comes to that, here's what I want us to understand. We are all simply a work in progress. We are all simply a work in progress. Say that with me. We are all simply a work in progress, which means, one, we should never get too prideful when we feel like we've perfected these things, right? Because we never will fully. But then two, knowing that we're a work in progress. Two, we need to also never get too down on ourselves when we struggle with these, because of course we will. Guys, as we journey into each new day, right, we can only move forward very intentionally with God helping us. As we move forward into each new day, knowing that we do in fact have the power to choose what will define and shape our character in the future, as we do that, may each of us, with God's help, let the character of Christ be the character we strive to intentionally conform to. Let's pray.